All right, welcome class to our week 4 lecture presentation. We're going to be talking about tone and style this week. So let's go ahead and get started. Keep in mind that the expectations this week include reading page 165 to 200, and the stories we're going to focus on are the William Faulkner piece and the Ernest Hemingway story. So be sure to zoom in on those two stories as well as the content of these pages. Also, we have the discussion board this week, which will talk about those two stories by Faulkner and Hemingway. And then, of course, to watch the week 4 lecture presentation. So if you are watching, excellent job. So let's talk about tone and style. So what is tone? Our textbook says that tone is whatever leads us to infer the author's attitude. That is commonly called tone. And tone could be multidimensional. It doesn't have to be just one particular attitude for an entire story. It's going to have nuance. Different sections of a story will have different tones depending on the plot sequence, depending on the characters. So, but think about it in terms of the overall attitude or even the author's attitude in the narrative. This is also an impression that will be shared through the plot, through the characters, and also beyond that with the word choice of the entire story. And like I mentioned before, it's going to have different nuances depending on the section of the story and the point in the plot sequence. But think attitude. So what is style? Style is basically the way that the story is written. And this has more specific connotations than tone. So tone can be considered one element of style. This encompasses the traits or characteristics of a piece of writing. This could be the way that the writer manages characters, plot, or even word choice. So like I mentioned, tone can definitely be a part of someone's style, and it's also connected to the modes of expression. So how does the author utilize literary devices, other forms of expression like diction, irony, even sentence structure, the organization of the story? All of those are encompassed in this idea of style. And a lot of times we'll see style go beyond just one particular story. An author may have a similar style for lots of stories, or it could be, lots of styles within one. So it's just the way that the actual words, the story itself, is presented. So let's break these down. So diction has to do with word choice and vocabulary. So that's very specific, right? So this is the class of words that an author decides is appropriate to use in a particular work. So this could be in terms of a varied vocabulary, whether it is a vocabulary that seems pompous, a vocabulary that is very young and even babyish. It could be a vocabulary that's very angry. So you get this overall impression just by the word choice in the story. So it can be an abstract word choice, more concrete, close to the way that we speak. It could be in lots of different things. So really flowery, really academic. So diction has to do with those word choice. And similes and metaphors are very wrapped up in this idea of diction. I was reading an essay by Helen Keller this last week, and it was an essay discussing what it was like for her to acquire language. So if we remember the story of Helen Keller, she was born healthy, but at age 18 months she got very sick, and through that sickness she lost her ability to see and lost her ability to hear. And it wasn't for 7 years, until she was 7 years old, that Anne Sullivan came to teach her language. And so she was basically, in the dark for that amount of time. And So the essay was about that kind of aha moment of acquiring language and understanding that there are expressions that relate to experience. So, one of the things that she said in the essay, trying to help us to understand how it was, what it was like before she acquired language. And this would be what I would call an extended metaphor. So similes and metaphors are where, when an author utilizes connections through comparisons. And a simile uses a comparison like or as, and a metaphor does not use like or as, but these are comparisons that are made, and the purpose of them is to help the readers make connections to things that they may not actually have experience with. So, in the terms of Helen Keller, I've never been blind or deaf, and so she's trying to portray that through an extended metaphor. And the metaphor basically in the essay was that she said that she was like being on a ship in the middle of an ocean in a dense fog. And if you think about that, it's going to be a white fog and you're out afloat, and all you have around you is just ocean, but you can't even see it. And she describes that even though in an ocean, in a boat would have a compass or a lighthouse, and she didn't even have that. So she was just in this dense fog without any sense of direction. And that was a really cool way for her to describe to us that do not have the same experience, and to understand what it was like before acquiring language. So that is an extended metaphor. It was over a paragraph long. So usually similes and metaphors are a few words or phrases strung together. An extended metaphor is going to be something that takes up more space, basically. But it's an interesting way to view how we can make connections with what the writer is trying to portray to us. It's how we have a clear understanding of what a writer is doing, even though we may not have actually experienced whatever the writer is describing. Other things that relate to style, and that could be sentence structure and organization. So this is the way that the sentences are composed in terms of length and variety. For instance, some authors might mix things up by using long, detailed sentences punctuated by short sentences, and that emphasizes a particular idea by using those short sentences next to longer ones. The length and complexity of the sentence could add to the style. I always think of Nathaniel Hawthorne and reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. If you have not read any of his works, that might be something to take a look at. But I mean, all of the sentences are super long and detailed and drawn out, and the paragraphs are super long and have so much detail. They all fit together, and it's actually very beautiful writing, but my goodness, it's just long and drawn out, and that's his style. He wants to give every detail through the sentence structure and the organization. Even things like interjections, unlike Nathaniel Hawthorne, but even things like interjections, like parentheses or dashes, can be indicative of a style. Especially when you see parentheses a lot in a writer, you kind of get this idea that the flow of descriptions and ideas in a story are always being interrupted. So you put little parentheses in, and they don't really have to do with what's going on, or they add more or go off on a tangent, and so you see the writer or the narrator interrupting itself over and over again, which can create a certain kind of style. Also, in terms of organization, this can relate to the length of paragraphs or the order of events in a story, and that can also determine style a bit. So maybe an author likes to use flashback or share the conclusion of the story at the beginning, so you already know what's going to happen. This could have to do with perspective and point of view. So style can really encompass a lot of different things when it comes to literature for sure. So one element of style that is an interesting thing to look at is irony. And this is a literary device in which a discrepancy of meaning is masked beneath the surface of the language. Irony is present when writers say one thing but mean something else, or something quite opposite. We think of it in terms of, daily speech. Is sarcasm. Sarcasm can often be ironic. For instance, you see your friend fall down and you say, wow, that was graceful. Well, obviously falling down is not graceful, so it's an opposite, but it's a very sarcastic thing to say. So sarcasm is definitely a kind of irony. Then it's more of it every day. And it's also related to another thing on this list. But let's go through these. So one form of irony is dramatic irony, and this is when the reader understands the implication and meaning of a situation and may foresee an oncoming disaster or triumph, while the character does not. And this happens a lot when we see third-person perspective utilized in a story, because as the reader, we get the viewpoint of more than one character in third-person perspective. We see the overall picture when an individual character may not get to see that. So an individual character doesn't have insight into other characters' thoughts. The individual character may not be present during something that's described in the story. So that happens more often, I'd say, with third-person perspective or a limited omniscient and that kind of stuff, where you see multiple perspectives. And then you could kind of infer what is going to happen. And so it's dramatic irony. It's creating a drama because we know what's going to happen, but they don't know, and you just want to say, hey, pay attention, but they don't know. So it's dramatic. Then there's cosmic irony, and this is used a lot in, mythology. You see a lot of this. Another way to put it would be irony of fate. So in Greek mythology, fate is kind of a big deal. So this is a situational irony that emphasizes the discrepancy between what characters deserve and what they get, or between a character's aspiration and the treatment he or she receives at the hands of fate. I often think of Oedipus in this. Oedipus, yes. In this regard, because the whole thing is that Oedipus was meant to kill his father and marry his mother, right? And it was prophesied when he was born, and the family did all these things to prevent this prophecy to come true in his life. And the things that they did to prevent it actually caused it. So here he could not run from fate. And I also, random, so you think of Kung Fu Panda and the turtle. There's a little speech that the turtle says to Po about, no, not Po, sorry, that says to, the teacher. They're having that conversation about the peach tree, and if you plant it, what will come out? It's going to be a peach tree. It's not going to come out of something else. So you can't really run from the fate that you have before you. So cosmic irony there. And then there's verbal irony, which is very similar to sarcasm, but this is a statement in which the speaker or writer says the opposite of what is really meant. So that's actually a statement rather than, an overall situation. So that's why it's very similar to sarcasm. So I have a video for you all to watch, and it's a little excerpt from a movie called Becoming Jane. Now, I can't show it here in this presentation right now because of copyright things. So I have the link here, and I'm going to post the actual video to the class so you can also pause this one and go to the next one and listen to it. But it's basically a small section of the movie where there's a conversation about irony and whether it is insult with a smile or if it produces truth that we may not have already known. So you should check it out. I wanted to spend a little time looking at these 4 quotes from a book called The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, because it's a very interesting use of style. A lot of times, like I mentioned before, writers will have a particular style that they use in lots of different stories. It's the voice that they have as writers. What Barbara Kingsolver does with her particular book, I thought is interesting, is that she creates a style for 4 different characters. So the story is shared through the eyes of 4 separate characters. So a chapter will be from this character, a chapter will be from this character, and so you kind of get to see the story develop and evolve through so many different styles. And basically the premise of the book is that a 1950s, I think, family from Georgia goes to the African Congo to be missionaries. So it's a husband and wife with 4 daughters, and the story is told through the perspective of the 4 daughters. We have an oldest, Rachel. We have twins that are in the middle, Leah and Ada, and then we have the youngest, Ruth May. And it's very interesting because the chapters kind of rotate. We see different perspectives from each voice, and I think that it's neat that each style associated with a character is very different, so we get to know their personalities through diction and through word choice and through the descriptions that are there, and I think it's interesting to take a look at. So I'm going to go ahead and read through these and talk about them. So the first one is by the oldest, Rachel, and the scenario, each of these are related to when the family finally arrives at the village that they're going to stay at and be missionaries for. So she says, "Man, oh man, are we in for it now, was my thinking about the Congo from the instant we first set foot. We are supposed to be calling the shots here, but it doesn't look to me like we're in charge of a thing, not even our own selves. When we stepped off the airplane and staggered out into the field with our bags, the Congolese people surrounded us, lordy, in a chanting broil, charmed, I'm sure." So you kind of get this very sarcastic, kind of haughty teenager voice. Now, I'm not bashing teenagers, but kind of that typical, what I would think about of a bit of a rebellious city girl kind of voice in this particular character. And I thought, as you would go through the book, you'd see a lot of these. She uses a lot of slang terms that are indicative of the time period that the book is set in, and she likes reading magazines that are like teen magazines, just kind of that kind of character. And then we have the youngest daughter, Ruth May, and you can see in the style that the writer's trying to create this young persona. I think she's like 6 or 7 years old. Back home in Georgia, they have their own school, so they won't be strutting into Rachel and Leah and Ada's school. Leah and Ada are the gifted children, but they still have to go to the same school as everybody, but not the colored children. The man in church said they're different from us and needs ought to keep to their own. Jimmy Crow said that, and he makes the laws. They don't come in the zoo. Their day for the zoo is Thursday. That's in the Bible. So you could see the sentences are short and simple, and it relates to her family. So she is coming into the Congo, and this is what she's thinking about as she's seeing the Africans in the village. So she's relating it to her own experience, and she's relating it to her family. We also see very short, simple sentences and kind of a misunderstanding of her surroundings. And she also kind of drifts from subject to subject as she's thinking about it. And I can imagine, my own kids and how they're young, and how when my oldest was little, like 6 or 7, I mean, you just go from topic to topic, and it's really hard to follow. And that's kind of how little kids talk. So she uses that implication of word choice and diction and style to create that young character. So the next two are from the twins, and the first one's from Leah Price. And I think that Leah, from my understanding of the book, I think that Leah is probably the most authentic voice of the author. In terms of the way that she experiences the Congo, she really embraces the people and becomes an advocate for the people. And so we see kind of that theme throughout the book. And her connection to Africa seems to be a reflection of the message that Barbara Kingsolver is trying to portray in the book. And her voice becomes very prevalent in the whole book. So we can kind of see that as a real connection to the author, and the attitude and tone of the entire book is wrapped up in this particular character, Leah Price. And it's somewhat in the character of the other twin as well, but it's an interesting dichotomy for sure. So here is Leah Price responding to the same kind of time frame as these other characters. And then he led us out through the oval doorway into the light. We stood blinking for a moment, staring out through the dust at 100 dark villagers, slender and silent, swaying faintly like trees. And I think that this shows that connection that Leah is eventually going to have with the Congo, because here we have the family moving from a dark inside out into the light, and so that kind of gives us this idea of enlightenment and how she's moving from darkness in her previous life into a light of connectedness with this village. And then we also see, more poetic language like alliteration, slender and silent, swaying faintly like trees, and it's more poetic. And so we see a writer, in this passage. And I also think that the connection to the trees is very beautiful, and so we have a perspective of connectedness throughout the language of this particular quote. And I think that really reflects the overall tone of the story for sure. And the last one is Ada Price, and she is definitely different. This character is a twin, and she is gifted like Ruth May had mentioned, but she is what the family has called, what was it? Through half-brained. So the family has called her half-brained before, but she chooses to not speak. And she finds speaking difficult, and chooses not to. Most of the time she will speak out every once in a while, but generally not. She reads front and back, so she can read from the beginning to the end, and then from the end to the beginning. She can read frontwards and backwards, and she just thinks about things in a really different way. So you can see that reflected in the tone and the voice and style of this particular character. Sunrise, tantalize, evil eyes, hypnotize, that is the morning, Congo pink. A wide red plank of dirt, the so-called road, flat out in front of us, continuous, in theory, from here to somewhere distant. But the way I see it through my Ada eyes, oh, the world is a boggle with colors and shapes competing for a half-brain's attention. The parade never stops. Into the jangled pieces of road, little jungle roosters step from the bush, carcadoodling. They jerk up their feet with cocky roosterness, as if they have not yet heard about the two-legged beasts who are going to make slaves of their wives. So this is a really interesting voice, and I think even more poetic than Leah's voice. It obviously we see the rhyming elements at the beginning: sunrise, tantalize, evil eyes, hypnotize. And so she has a very poetic kind of voice, and you see very descriptive details, sensory details, but she doesn't focus on the people, which I think is very different from the other characters that are presented. The same kind of idea. She's really focused on the landscape, on viewing all of her senses, and then we have this metaphor at the end related to chickens, or at least a bit of irony, if you will. So here she's saying that these jungle chickens come into the road, jungle roosters, and they're acting like roosters would. They're cocky, they lift their feet up, and they have their cock-a-doodle-doodling and all that kind of stuff, but they're not aware. It says, not yet heard that about the two-legged beasts who are going to make slaves of their wives. That's very chicken-like, right? So that's that's what's going to happen. So the hens are used for laying eggs, and the two-legged beasts are humans. So you have a very literal interpretation of that. But if you look at it from another perspective, you can also see the two-legged beasts as the family coming into this village, and the villagers are not aware. They don't realize that what are coming in are going to make slaves of their wives. So they're going to enslave the people in some way. So it kind of is ominous in terms of what's going to happen in the novel, and it also uses language and kind of a poetic voice to convey those ideas rather than a more literal voice. And that's really kind of gives us insight into who this Attic character is. So these are the 4 different voices, and I think it's a really cool way to see how an author can utilize style in a very specific connection with characters, and how the author, a lot of times authors have the same style in many different pieces of writing, but here Barbara Kingsolver has utilized different styles, not only within separate books, but within one book. So we have 4 separate voices that are very distinct, that have unique viewpoints, unique word choices and sentence structures and organization. And so we see a development of personality and character through the style in which she uses for each chapter in the book. So it's a really cool way to look at style and how that can differ. So if you wanted to check out the book, you definitely should. It's very interesting. So when you're considering analyzing tone and style in a work, look at the flavor of words chosen by the author in a particular story. Do they have a certain tone, right? That's an attitude. Do they have an overall mood that is expressed? Last week I mentioned the character in Scott Westerfeld's The Uglies, and how she described the sunset, and that conveyed a mood, an attitude that the character had during that time in the book. And so you can look at word choice and how that connects to attitude and tone. Other things, look for patterns in the story's sentence structures. So sentence structure can definitely create an overall style and tone to a work depending on the way the sentence structure is used. Is it very complex? Is it very short and in short snippets? Does that create an angry feeling, or more academic, or more flowery? Is it too expressive? So take a look at how sentence structure can help convey that tone and style. Other things, try to determine the writer's attitude through the story's telling. So looking at the plot and looking at the characters, looking at those elements in which the story is conveyed, and is there an attitude that's presented with it? Is there an overall point? What's the point of the story, and how does that connect to attitude and tone? And then examine the order in which information is presented and how that develops the overall storyline. So is there, are there flashbacks? Is there foreshadowing? Does the author tell you what's going to happen in the end at the very beginning of the story and then reveals the details? Are they trying to shock you with startling plot twists? So examine that, the order of the information, the organization, to understand the style of the author. Sorry. So this is my works cited page, and if you wanted to check out any of these, they are available. Here's the information you would need to get them. Of course, we have our textbook, but I also have the Kingsolver book information there and the clip that I would like you to take a look at. If you do have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me. You can send me an email, shoot me a text, give me a call. Otherwise, I hope that this was helpful in understanding tone and style, and have a wonderful week. Bye.